Hi, and welcome to the Existential Coach. This week's episode is called Broken Mirrors, the Fragmented Self, or the Self and Fragmentation. And what I want to talk about is the way in which we repeat certain patterns in our lives, which were our response to the experience of fragmentation, or our understanding of the world, our way of being in the world as we had hoped or had wished, being fractured or fragmented. And so this idea of the mirror is that we are looking to see or to recognize these feelings and sensations, these dreams, these aspirations in the world. These are a kind of set of expectations that we have, that things will go a certain way, operate a certain way, and that allows us to have a sense of continuity. This continuity translates into a feeling of safety. And this is a relatively intuitive experience for us. That is, if I'm feeling like things are rolling along and they're making sense to me, I don't feel overwhelmed, then I feel safe. I feel that there's a continuity to life that in an almost maternal way is holding me. Then things happen. Something comes in, something is introduced that ruptures or impedes this, or challenges this way of understanding our own reflected sense of self as a self that is in the world. And that challenge cracks or breaks the mirror. In cases of trauma, where there's been a violent act or a series of acts over time, this repetition of fragmentation, this continuingly breaking of this mirror of self, creates a pattern of chaos, of disorganization, where we are responding to and responding within a state of uncertainty. And that need for safety, that need for continuity, is this fundamental need to not be continually overwhelmed, and the experience of trauma, of having, in whatever way, be it an individual event or a series of events over time, this patterning of chaos. And that starts to raise really significant questions for us in terms of how we trust or do not trust the world in which we live. If I've had a negative experience, if I've had a profoundly traumatic experience, the loss of continuity is felt in a way that terrorizes me. And I am then captured within this broken mirror. And in my effort to try and put the pieces back together again, I will find any way I can. I will adopt anything that could give me some reprieve from the horror of this existential loss. So, for example, the use of drugs and alcohol become a way to medically, in a sense, respond to the terror of fragmentation. And within this response, there is an effort to try and solve this crisis of fragmentation. Now, of course, people on the outside can look and say that's not going to help. It's going to actually exacerbate the issue. It's going to make things worse. And this is where we get into the idea of enactments playing out the duality of a situation as a repetition that traps us within this dialectical narrative. So we'll unpack this. If I've experienced something that has ruptured my way of understanding myself in the world, and if my solution to that is to drink, and if drinking perpetuates this state of fragmentation while offering or seeming to offer a comfort, then I haven't transcended the enactment, which means I haven't acknowledged or been able to face the other, or the, quote, not me aspect of this experience. I have found a way to medicate through alcohol, but I have not found a way to transcend, as in to incorporate aspects of my experience that are right now fragmented. That is, they are not included in a self in a more grounded way. And as I mentioned earlier, if we think about being in a state of safety, having a sense of continuity, then everything that's happening to us, all of the issues, all of the experiences that are emerging, can be brought into our self-experience. So in that way, we're not experiencing a sense of danger. That is, we're not experiencing a sense of I cannot incorporate these things that are coming in. We're experiencing the opposite. We're experiencing a sense of inclusion. And it's because these things are not threatening us. They're not dangerous. They're not shattering our mirror of self. However, when we go through traumatic experiences, what's being imposed upon us in this world, in this situation, the events that we're being thrown into, have now presented us with things, experiences, that have shattered our sense of self, and we are placed in this very challenging situation of how do we start to incorporate that which we do not think of as us within us? How do we start to bring in and understand and decipher these not me experiences? And I should say, this is not about agreeing with or adhering to. It's certainly not about compliance. It's about finding our own authentic relationship to experiences that challenge our own identity. So going back to this example of drinking as a way to remedy or purportedly remedy the experience of trauma that a person has endured. One of the things we might notice is those traumatic experiences, although it may be the case that an individual is aware of them as events in their life, the question becomes, how aware are they in an embodied way? So this is where we can start to think about how the embodied sensations of our lived experience operate on a different frequency than the cognitive ways that we might conceptualize things. So cognitively speaking, we're conceptualizing things within a context. This includes the language that we speak, or the languages that we speak. It includes the culture within which we live. And that can become complicated because we might have been born in one country, moved to another. We might have had relationships or been married to someone or more than one person from different cultures, had children. There may be all sorts of different factors, work different types of careers, so we were introduced to different kinds of people. All this to say is all of this adds a layering of contexts. And what that effectively does is it creates a way of understanding ourselves in the world. So if we think about a context as a frame, and we think about understanding ourselves within that frame, and then we think about the loss of that frame and how that loss of context, whatever that context is, creates a sense of distress or crisis. And we then start to ask ourselves, how do I address or face that which I conceptually do not have the language to describe. I don't have a word for it yet, so to speak. There's a great line in the Muppets movie. Gonzo sings this song. It's called "I'm Going to Go Back There Someday." And he has this wonderful line I've always loved. He says, "There's not a word yet for old friends who've just met." And this idea of of words that we haven't found yet for experiences that we have had, that we are experiencing things and we may not have a conceptual frame, just gives us a bit of an indication that we can, in an embodied way, experience things. But in a cognitive way, we may only have either a partial or a broad strokes way of conceptualizing it, or we may not have a word yet for old friends who've just met. And that starts to lead us down this path, at least for me, where I'm thinking about, well, what is this embodied experience? And broadly speaking, the embodied way of understanding, that is, the embodied experience of something, operates in its own language. You could think of it as, AM and FM on a radio. And these differences, if they're not understood, may mean that we essentially operate within a form of categorical errors, which is to say we apply cognitive understanding to embodied experiencing. And we get frustrated when the cognitive understanding or the cognitive interpretation doesn't actually address or remedy the embodied experience. And in that, whatever doesn't fit into the cognitive model, we discount. Now, this is significant, and this plays into the example I was saying earlier about, the individual who's drinking, who's reenacting the paradox of the solution is the crisis, and the crisis is the solution. Similarly here, if our methodology for understanding our experience doesn't allow the fulsome experience to be expressed, and our response is to cut away whatever doesn't fit into our cognitive model, then now we're engaging in a form of self-fragmentation. We are rationalizing the fragmented mirror. We are not able to bring in the not me, so to speak. We are essentially saying anything that cannot be described, anything that does not have a word, doesn't get included. Yet, if there is not a word yet for old friends who've just met, if there is not a word yet for our experience, does that mean our experience does not exist? Here we get into a very interesting, and Kierkegaard had this idea of, you're taking a leap of faith. You're kind of jumping in, and at a certain point, your cognition can only take you so far. And if we can jump in, if we can say, okay, well, conceptually speaking, I've gone this far with my thoughts and my, analysis and my interpretation. It could be also my expression in terms of artistic expression or creative expression. Yet it's taken me a long way, but I still don't know. And it's that moment. What do you do when you still don't know? Going back to the example I had mentioned earlier about drinking and the way in which the drinking was the solution and a repetition of the problem, there is a kind of wisdom in the fact that it is repeating. Now, of course, from one perspective, it's quite perilous because the pattern is repeating, which can be torturous. From another perspective, there is hope within that repetition, that some part of us is saying, we can do this, we can face this, here it is, we can step into this, we can explore this. Now, we might say that this hope is perhaps smaller or not as bright as the feeling of doubt that things are much worse than we could ever manage. So the overwhelming wave of dread or the overwhelming fog of dread makes it really hard to see the lighthouse of hope. Yet there is in the distance this lighthouse, this hope. And so if we can start to really focus on the lighthouse through the fog of dread, through the shattered edges of our mirror, and see that there is something we can move towards, hence transcend. There is a place we can go that we are not, but we can go towards. That starts to change the dynamic in a way that shifts from this experience of dread, experienced in a fully embodied way, understood conceptually, to hope. And here we can say that the hope we are aspiring toward, the hope and the ideal, the quest for healing, or the exploration of self beyond self, which is to say, seeing ourself as this changing dynamic set of relationships. Like I had mentioned earlier, the idea of living in different countries, or marrying people, or kids, or all of these different intersecting dynamics. If we start to see that, okay, there's a lot of different things going on that create what I am calling me, or what I'm calling myself, and that the very nature of this suggests that there is change, yet at the same time I'm able to recognize myself. I'm aware of myself as being the same person I was when I was 5, and currently I'm 50, so there's a continuity that is existing even within all this change. So what is it that's operating within this continuity, and what is it that's operating within this discontinuity, and what is this dynamic, and how can I engage this dynamic? And as we discussed, this idea of introducing trauma, or the broken mirror, how can we start to explore this through the, albeit maybe diminished or less or smaller, the metaphor of the fog of dread, yet we can see the lighthouse of hope. How can we start moving towards that? Going back to the individual who's drinking as the remedy, if that becomes the solution, and we don't acknowledge that they may see the lighthouse of hope, yet the behavior is such that it would be like losing the only safe thing they have, even though from the outside, and even though they may acknowledge that it's destructive, even though from the outside they can see people see it's destructive, and on the inside, so to speak, they can see it as destructive. The idea of leaving that involves a great deal of uncertainty. And so we've come to this point twice now in this podcast, and I've talked about uncertainty and the unknown a number of times throughout all of these podcasts. What do we do when we're at that point? What do we do when we're at, as Kierkegaard talked about, the end of cognition, or the end of our conceptualization? What do we do when we've flushed out, gone as far as we can within the cognitive worlds of our existence? Do we jump? For him, it's this leap of faith, which, as I take it, is his way of expressing that relying upon the external context of our existence can create a kind of dependency that may not allow us to have the kind of individual sophistication and the individual clarity as to the uniqueness of our experience. And within that is the notion that human beings are all unique, that we are all different, that of course we have all sorts of things that we share. Yet you get to a certain point and you have to ask yourself, just yourself, what do I want to do? Do I want to step back, or do I want to take the next step? Do we want to stay within the familiar dread not because we like it and not because it's where we want to be, but because it's familiar? Or do we want to step into the unknown? And here is the paradox. because our experience of the unknown has been disastrous. The lesson in the unknown is it is punitive, it is bad. So, yes, a person can say, I've had these bad experiences, and I've found a way through, by analogy, drinking, but it could be any number of things. And on some level, they're saying, but it won't be worse. And I know, the devil I know is better. And that speaks to the way in which we internalize these traumatic events and these traumatic experiences, taking responsibility for them, becoming accountable for them, and bearing them. And this weight is so profound that we are effectively parenting ourselves or trying to save ourselves through the containment of something that has been horrifying, or events over time that have been continually horrifying. So if we think about this shattered mirror, if we think about this idea of the fragmented self, if we think about this idea of there's not a word yet for old friends you've just met, if we think about the way in which conception or conceptualization only takes us so far, that embodiment is operating in a way that may be outside of that which we are yet able to conceptualize, and this question of leap of faith, and all of this being framed within this idea of moving towards hope or transcendence, what are we being asked to do? Now, I'm not saying there's a collective answer, but I can say for myself, what I'm being asked to do is step into territories that I simply do not want to step into. Territories within my own experience, territories within my way of understanding and knowing, quote unquote, knowing myself. I am being challenged to see or release myself from the idea I've been clinging to of self. And some aspects of that may have been quote unquote healthy, some aspects of that may have been quote unquote unhealthy. Whatever it is, this idea of the self and continuity was a way to create a stable, functioning person or being within a changing world. However, if I am holding on to a way of coping, and that way of coping precludes me from growth, from expression, from moving beyond feelings of shame, moving beyond feelings of self-doubt. If that model of my existence, albeit a model that had protected and held me in some way, has no longer been able to keep up with the embodied understanding of my experience, if the language is no longer descriptive enough, if the concepts are no longer robust enough, yet I hold on to them, does this, or may this create a sense of shame that we are not able, for whatever reason, to acknowledge aspects of our own experience that are othered within us, that are not integrated within us? And might that lead to the projective identification, which is to say we project aspects of ourselves we are unable to include within our own experience onto others that we can then persecute? And does that not create the kind of cycle and pattern within our own life that keeps us from finding the shore, keeps us from finding a word for old friends who've just met, that keeps us from seeing that the lighthouse is the place of hope, and that the fog of despair is the mist of trauma, the fog of trauma that keeps us, holds us in a state of terror. And I use the word terror here just to emphasize how the existential experience of loss, of death, and how profound that is, this sense of dread, is a very good reason to try and avoid dread, which is to say, our motivation to try and escape this feeling is a natural response. And the fact that we have been able to do that, we have been able to escape, let's say by drinking, is, and this might sound strange to some people, is an act of hope. It is an attempt within a world gone mad to do something. The question is, can we continue to explore and acknowledge that we are always in the world, we are always defined and mitigated and restricted by and all of the rest of it, we are always operating within a context or context plural. And what this means is, or what this may suggest is, can we start to look at the context as something we can engage and still feel safe? If we've experienced a rupture, and we all have, if we've experienced this rupture, then what we've experienced is that the context can be dangerous and we are afraid to engage the context. However, if we are able to move towards the context, engage the context, then we can start to see the patterns that have arisen in our lives, that have in many ways become the kind of vernacular of our lives, or the idiom of our lives. And from that, explore how we may be able to step beyond this context and realize that if I go beyond this conceptualization or the cognitions or the understandings or the definitions of self, from one side, it feels like, well, here's an analogy that, people had thought the world was flat. Some people still do, but generally speaking, people had thought the world was flat. So the idea was you could get in a ship and you could fall off the earth. This is very much like that idea of thinking in a flat earth way versus a round earth way, or the globe. Whereas with the globe, you're going back and forth, you're moving around. Whereas the other one, you have this idea that you will just fall off. And the idea of this leap of faith, of taking a jump, we may find that we can go round and round and explore. So I'll end off with this idea from the Muppet movie, which I really like that line, there's not a word yet for old friends who just met. And what I've always loved about that in different ways is it articulates how there may not be a word yet for something you have experienced. And just because there is not a word yet doesn't mean you have not experienced it. And if we're able to explore aspects of our experience beyond the words we know, what will happen is our language will expand, which means our world will expand. And if that happens, there becomes a deeper understanding of our own embodied experience and of the experience we're having as something that is growing towards hope and moving away from dread. So, thanks a lot, and until next time, bye for now.